I was the first Maryland graduate to go to Case Western University for an internship. After my internship, the Berry Plan was in operation. The Berry Plan was a military plan to get more physicians into the military services right after the Korean War. And we had a choice of Air Force, Navy, or Army, and I chose the Air Force. So, and luckily I asked to be sent to flight surgery school, and they agreed to that. They sent me to flight surgery school in San Antonio, Texas for 3 months. And that was late 1957, I guess. I was assigned to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It was one of the major bases, and it had a big hospital there. I went there and showed up in front of the commander's office. And I said, you know, my chief of neurology suggested I do neurology in the Air Force. He said, we don't need neurologists, son. We need psychiatrists. You're going to be a psychiatrist. I said, well, I'm not afraid of that. I had good psychiatric exposure in my internship in med school. I said, but I'd like to be a flight surgeon too. He says, we'll fix that up too. You can be a flight surgeon. The second year, I became a flight surgeon. And what happened was there were 3 young doctors there, and we flipped a coin for fighter, bomber, or transport flight surgeons. I won the fighter. And I got a little nervous at first thinking about this, you know. But that turned out to be a wonderful opportunity. Wright-Patterson had some of the best fighter pilots in the Air Force, including Gus Grissom. He was there as a fighter pilot. And most of these guys, many of them had experiences in Korea and combat. And I would meet with them every Thursday, and we'd talk about medical things and flying. And usually I'd go flying with them. My favorite was the F-100F, a 2-seater F-100. I wore sunglasses both for light and to hide the fear in my eyes as I was getting into the back seat of this. There's a picture I took from flying an F-100, and it was next to us. We were about 40,000 feet when that picture was made. It was beautiful stuff. I did a lot of flying in the Air Force. I flew around the world with a diabetic general, and he was the new chief of Air Force Intelligence. It was an interesting flight, and all the way around the world we landed at these places, and the general would go to meetings, and the crew would wander around and go to places around town, a couple of days each place. Gus Grissom and I were friends. Of course, I went to his party when he left Wright-Patterson to become an astronaut, not knowing I would join him later. But Gus was a remarkable, these guys were all fantastic pilots. After that, I got out of the Air Force in '59 and went back to Case Western University to continue my residency in medicine. As it happened, President Eisenhower appointed the chief of Case, Keith Glennon, as the first NASA chief. And I was walking down the hall one day, and Dr. Clark Rant, was chief of neurology, and he was the neighbor of Keith Glennon, the new chief of NASA. He stopped me in the hall and said, you know, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just back from Air Force. He said, well, how would you like to become a physician of the astronauts? I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, you'll go to some place called Hampton, Virginia, and you'll spend most of the time with me in Washington. Well, I talked to my wife, and we decided to do it, of course, and came to Hampton, and that was about late '59 or early '60, something like that, and joined the Space Task Group. And I was one of about 6 doctors. Myself, Jim Henry, and Bill Augerson were remarkable guys. They had been involved in the selection of the astronauts, which happened in the late '50s. Jim Henry and Bill Augerson, and Carmel Jackson was a young physician there. Bill Douglas was the physician for the astronauts, the personal physician for the astronauts. And Stan White was also one of the physicians there. So I think we're about 6 of us, or maybe 7. And to my knowledge, only 2 of us are still alive. Bill Augerson was a remarkable guy, a brilliant guy. And I just talked to him about a week ago, because I told him I was going to do this. In the space agency, this organization of life sciences within the Space Task Group, it was an incredible operation. 500 men in this whole Space Task Group. day and night, these guys working. I think the whole operation was run as well as the Manhattan Project. This project was just as good. I mean, these guys, and unfortunately, we're dealing with this pea shooter rocket. The Redstone rocket was a pea shooter. And we learned later the Russians probably had 400,000 pounds of thrust, and we had less than 50,000 pounds of thrust. That made that kind of differential in opportunity at the time. And the capsule was dictated by the dimensions of the Redstone rocket. And it was tight, very tight piece of machinery, and with the instrument panel just right staring at you right in front of your face. Really a tight fit. Once we got going in the Space Task Group with projects, each of us had different responsibilities, or the doctors. And one of mine was we had 13 range stations around the world. And Bermuda was the first one off the coast. I appointed myself the Bermuda surgeon. And we would fly out of Newport News. I never forget some of these flights. One time I was in a small plane, and the pilot looked like he was about 75 or 80 years old. And but I was comforted by next to him was sitting one of the astronauts who was a great pilot, so I wasn't too worried. And myself and an engineer, the three of us would get in this plane, fly to New York, and get on the first-class Pan Am flight to Bermuda. And we'd arrive in Bermuda, and our man would be waiting for us with our motorbikes. And he'd take the gear to the officers' quarters where we'd stay, and we'd head to downtown Hamilton. We would spend 2 weeks down there, and we would put on tapes around the whole system, mimicking astronauts flying over, running through what would happen and what might happen in terms of problems. It was right at the tip of an island off the airport. And I mean, it was surf pounding all around it. And I'd drive out to the end of this thing and the hum of the generators, and it was out of this world kind of stuff. I'd walk in and see we had a big map of the world with the tracking of the capsules projected on the wall, or on them. And it was put on my headsets and be talking to somebody in Australia. I mean, this was 1961, so it was really far-fetched stuff for those days. I was there in Bermuda when they recovered Enos, and there was a huge party at one of the houses, and I got there late, and the only thing I could find a drink out of was the sugar bowl. I had to pour the sugar. It was very raucous. We had nothing to do with it, with the chimp, but we were celebrating his success. My job also in the Space Task Group, an important part of this was we ran the astronauts on the Navy centrifuge in Johnsville, Pennsylvania. And we would examine the astronauts, measure his lung function, before and after, blood pressure, all basic kind of stuff. And then they would run the G-loads of the Atlas and the Redstone rockets. And of course, the G-loads were transverse because of the position of the astronaut on his back with his feet up. And then we'd examine the astronauts after the run. This turned out to be important stuff because it did convey to the astronauts the kind of G-loads that they did experience in the actual flights. And they all commented that this was a very important part of their training. I got on this thing once myself. It was very unpleasant. I think it was 11 Gs on re-entry or something, and you really couldn't breathe much. Luckily, it wasn't very long. Not long after that, Bob Gilruth, who was the chief of the Space Task Group, got a letter from John Kennedy was president then, and he had a number of advisory committees that he had appointed in engineering and medicine was a very important one. And they had, I think, chief of medicine at Duke and Harvard, and a Nobel Prize winner in radiation from Caltech. I mean, it was a very high-powered operation. They sent down a letter to Gilruth saying, you know, we'd like to have a little more confirmation of the safety of the astronauts. What are you doing to help us with that? So he called me in, Gilruth did, and said, I want you to go up to this committee in Washington and tell them what we've done with the centrifuge runs. So I said, okay. So I went up there, flew up, and went into this place. I so wish I'd kept notes and stuff, but I didn't. But they were very nice to me as I explained to them the data we had about running the centrifuges and the G loads, etc. They were very, accepting, and they thanked me. And about 2 weeks later, Gilruth got this letter from this organization saying, we appreciate the information we have, but we really feel we need some more information to assure the safety of our astronauts. Well, Gilruth looked at that and he just threw it right into the trash next to them. This was not going to be delayed in any way by any medical Mickey Mouse. And I think, in fact, the fact that the Russians had gone before us and survived was some, a primitive, but probably a way to assure us that this was not going to be a major hazard in terms of health of the astronauts. They had no special training program, and they all trained differently. Some would run on the beach, some would do lift weights, but they were doing some things like that. And all of these guys had at least 10,000 jet hours. And Grissom and Slayton and Glenn had all been in combat. We also were having quite a debate in the office about the Mercury capsule would not accommodate a two-gas system. It was just too small, a nitrogen-oxygen system. And so we had pure oxygen in the system. And it was known that in World War II, Spitfire and Hurricane fighter pilots on oxygen at high altitude could get atelectasis when they pulled G's. There was no nitrogen to keep the spaces open in the small areas of alveoli of the lung, and they get collapse of these basal parts of the lung in dives and pulling G's on pure oxygen. Of course, the astronauts were not doing those kinds of maneuvers, although they had brief G loads coming and going. But this had great importance later on in Apollo, which probably had a chance for both oxygen and nitrogen, but I don't think they used it at first. It was a real good group of people to work with, and Dick Johnson was our leader. He was a terrific young engineer, and I don't know whether he's alive or not, but Christopher Kraft was a remarkable guy, and he was a heck of a leader in the whole operation of the actual flights. Shepard was an amazing guy. I actually wrote down their heart rates when they lifted off, and there are differences with these guys, of course. And anyway, Shepard was in the capsule, and of course we had these constant delays. Systems would say, well, we're not ready, and instead of a 1 or 2 hour countdown time, hell, it'd be 5 or 6 hours of this stuff. And in the middle of this, Shepard put out the word, boys, I can't hold it anymore. I've got to urinate. No, you're going to short out the whole system. You might cook yourself or something. He said, I'm going to do it. So he urinated in his suit. And anyway, luckily nothing happened. I went down to meet him as well with other doctors at Grand Bahama Island when he came in from the carrier. And he was fine. The guy was very alert and had no... Of course, they only had 15 minutes of flight, and so, but it was the weightlessness was no problem. It was controlling the thrusters. I mean, he felt very confident about it. Bill Augerson and I wrote the first article about physiologic responses of astronauts to space. They summarized the 3 flights here, which is MR3 astronaut Alan Shepard. Had a pre-flight physical exam at Cape Canaveral, approximately T-8 hours. His post-flight examinations were at Grand Bahama Island. Positive findings were limited to a 3-pound weight loss, a few rows heard at the base of both lungs, that's little crackling noises, which cleared with coughing. His general condition was excellent. Physical and laboratory findings were all within clinical observation made in association with his centrifuge training. So they compared the centrifuge data with the flight data. And it was the same with Gus Grissom. The sinking of the spacecraft and his subsequent exertion in the sea elevated his pulse and respiration rates appropriately. That was a scary time. And astronaut John Glenn's final pre-flight was T-6 hours. Post-flight examinations were at Grand Turk Island, I wasn't there for that. He had a 5-pound weight loss and blood pressure, pulse, etc., all pre-launch values. There were superficial abrasions on his right hand caused by the recoil of the explosive hatch when he was coming out of the capsule. And the remainder of the physical exam was normal. Basically, I think that the general feeling among the physicians was secondary to the engineers. I think the engineers were running this whole operation, and they weren't going to be delayed by any Mickey Mouse about what might happen because they had some information, again, from the Russian find that these guys made it. So that was probably one of the reasons that weightlessness was not considered to be a big problem. During the Glenn flight, we did a little experiment with John Glenn. And this was also assisted by someone from NIH, as I remember. They used xylose, which is a sugar, and asked him, when you get in flight and weightless, swallow these tablets. And then before you re-enter, want you to urinate. What we're seeing if absorption would work in weightless state, and of course it did. He swallowed the stuff and it went into his urine and into his kidney and in his bag, and so they found that it was a very simple test, but they were looking to see if food absorption could happen, and so that was done. And now Gus Grissom had a much more difficult time with this whole flight, as you know. His liftoff and flight time was fine. He landed in the water, and I was just reading it today again, what he said about this when he was manipulating it around in his capsule, and he had no idea what happened, but suddenly the door came off, and water was coming in, and it reminded me of another part of this story. Each of the astronauts were assigned a part of the program. Like one was the booster, one was the suit, one was, and Wally Schirra was the suit guy. And he'd been out in the water with his suit and realized this thing leaked like hell. I mean, the top of the thing just was not adequate. And so he made some changes in this and probably saved Grissom's life because he was slopping around in the water and the helicopter was overhead, downdrafting this, trying to hook up to the sinking capsule, and it was pushing Grissom down into the water, and he was slogging. I think he finally signaled that better get over here, and so the helicopter came over and dropped the sling, which he got in backwards because and they lifted him up, and his heart rate was very rapid, but it was very close, and later on, I think they dragged the capsule out of the bottom somewhere later on, I think, but that was very close for Gus. I was monitoring John Glenn, and Bill Douglas was sitting beside me, and I was reading his EKGs as I watched him go across. All of a sudden, he had a short run of abnormal rhythm, and I looked at this, and maybe a minute or two, he corrected it, and the heart rate came back his heart pattern came back to a normal pattern. I said nothing, which was the right thing to do, because I certainly didn't want to interrupt the countdown time, and it wasn't a medical emergency or anything. And that's what he wrote on that picture. He found out about that afterwards and sent me that. That's the best memo I have of the whole space age. There's only one of those in the world. Glenn he's decelerating from 17,000 miles an hour to 1,700 miles an hour when he starts seeing the atmosphere. And Control Central gets the idea that the heat shield is loose. And they don't want to tell Glenn this, of course. And so they tell him, now leave on the retro rocket, a three-prong thing hooked on the front of the heat shield, and which was sort of, normally it would be blown off. Well, they said, let's leave that on, John. Let's leave the heat shield on. So, I'm sure he was thinking the same thing. Boy, something is really a problem. And then he describes coming in, and he's looking out the window and starts seeing pieces of molten metal going by. So he's thinking, is this the heat shield or is this the, incredible. We did develop a blood pressure device that worked pretty well inside the suit. That was a big deal. But we monitored their respiration rate, and their electrocardiogram was very important to monitor. But basically, just talking to the astronaut and getting reports back was probably the most important thing. His ability to speak and look around and see what was happening. I mean, we were measuring some simple stuff, but his ability to assess his surroundings and talk about it was probably more important. One of the things that happened right after Glenn's successful flight, John Kennedy came down to Canaveral, and you know, it was a real thrilling time because of the success of this whole operation was very impressive. There was a lot going on because it was these guys were dedicated to get this job done, and the astronauts are busy with other things. If one of them wasn't flying, the others were getting ready for the next flight or preparing for further flights. And it was a busy place. Soon after John Glenn's flight, which was in '62, I stayed in the Space Task Group maybe for another 3 or 4 months, and then I went back to my residency in medicine at Case Western University Hospital. I could have stayed as a career in the organization, but I wanted to get back into the medical world, so that's what I did. When I was in Cleveland, back in Cleveland, I got a call from the Cleveland plane dealer, and they interviewed me. Oh. And this is a rather extensive interview. And a picture of me that looks awfully young and odd. But anyway, I made all these comments here. Let's see. It's been suggested that the problem of weightlessness might be overcome by spinning the spacecraft and creating artificial gravity by centrifugal force. Dr. Laughlin said he thought this would greatly complicate the technology. It would probably be a last resort if any flights indicated man could not endure long periods of weightlessness. Medication for motion sickness or to counteract pain is provided in the Mercury's capsule in case of an emergency. However, there are no plans to administer any drugs to Glenn during the flight. Anyway, there's stuff like this I wrote about that might be interesting. I'd forgotten about most of it. This was when I was 30 years old and back in residency. Not long after that, I was still involved with an experiment we were trying to do in space about calcium metabolism. And the organization had moved to Houston. And probably a year after I'd left this agency, I went down and stayed with Gus Grissom in his home for a few days. Not long after that, I was in practice in Newport News, and I got a phone call. And it was Gordon Cooper. And he was out here at Langley. And he said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" I said, "Well, I'm seeing patients." He says, "How about flying with me tomorrow?" So I said, "I'll be there." So I came out here, and he found a helmet for me, and and I brought my jump boots. You know, when you're flying at altitude, and if you eject, your shoes come off, your feet freeze. So you have lace-up boots if you're smart when you're flying at altitude. So anyway, I had the boots on and got a parachute, and he had a F-106B. Anyway, I climbed in the back of this thing, and we launched out of Langley, blasting down over the North Carolina coast, I think about 1,200 miles an hour in this thing. He said, "What do you think, Doc?" I said, "Fantastic airplane, Gordon." He says, "My first time, too." I wasn't really worried. I mean, this guy could fly anything. As a matter of fact, he had some of the best flights in the Gemini program. He was absolutely fantastic. One time he lost the automatic equipment and landed the thing, with manual stuff alone. And of course, he almost didn't continue on because he buzzed the Space Task Group one day and got in big trouble with the boys. And no, it was down in Florida where he buzzed the operation very low over the land. But anyway, they forgave him. I think the government itself was under enormous pressure because of the Russians to get this done and show that we can do it, even though our initial efforts were small before Glenn's flight. And it was a lot of pressure. And Kennedy had a lot of guts to announce, of course, going to the moon later, but also many of us in the Space Task Group, I was very alarmed about the fact that they were going to televise Alan Shepard's launch because the Redstone had been unreliable, going up a few feet and falling over and exploded, et cetera. And I just thought, if he's cooked in front of the American people, it's not going to be good. But Kennedy made the decision that they were going to televise it, and he turned out to be right. It was a restoration of the power of our country. We had been embarrassed by Russia, our mortal enemy at that time, and this was a certification that we had the smarts and the ability to get into this high complex business and win. And these successes were the very beginning of this. As we went into Gemini and Apollo, and we just got better every year. I guess it was in '62, we went to the top floors of the Chamberlain. Yes, we were locked up there for 3 days, looking at Apollo projects, looking at Apollo offerings. As physicians, we were looking at the crew operations and just looking in general at what they were offering. There were different companies that were competing for the Apollo project, and so we were up there talking about from our point of view. These guys, I mean, they did a heck of a job at Langley. Really, really did. And with everything, with the development of the capsule, the use of the rocket, the recovery methods. I mean, really, really smart people. We worked night and day. It was a remarkable time, and it was almost as if you wanted to know what one of the astronauts thought about something. Go down and paddle on the door and ask him. And there wasn't any paper back and forth and delays or anything like that. And we were very close with the astronauts, and I couldn't say that I saw any difference at all, except that they were all cool as cucumbers, at least on the outside. And if they were fearful, they hid it well, because they were incredibly competent and confident people. You know, to put yourself on top of a smoking rocket was in itself a brave thing to do, as far as I was concerned. And it was remarkable stuff. It really was a very exciting time. It was just amazing. And I didn't probably know quite what it meant at first, but it sounded like an adventure. It certainly was. And it was a real adventure. I was lucky to be there. These guys were all fantastic pilots. After that, I got out of the Air Force in '59 and went back to Case Western University to continue my residency in medicine. As it happened, President Eisenhower appointed the chief of Case, Keith Glennon, as the first NASA chief. And I was walking down the hall one day, and Dr. Clark Rant, was chief of neurology, and he was the neighbor of Keith Glennon, the new chief of NASA. He stopped me in the hall and said, "You know, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm just back from Air Force." He said, "Well, how would you like to become a physician of the astronauts?" I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "You'll go to some place called Hampton, Virginia, and you'll spend most of the time with me in Washington." Well, I talked to my wife, and we decided to do it, of course, and came to Hampton, and that was about late '59 or early '60, something like that, and joined the Space Task Group. And in combat, and I would meet with them every Thursday, and we'd talk about medical things and flying, and usually I'd go flying with them. My favorite was the F-100F, a two-seater F-100. I wore sunglasses both for light and to hide the fear in my eyes as I was getting into the back seat of this. There's a picture I took from flying an F-100, and it was next to us. We were about 40,000 feet when that picture was made. It was beautiful stuff. I did a lot of flying in the Air Force. I flew around the world with a diabetic general, and he was the new chief of Air Force Intelligence. It was an interesting flight, and all the way around the world we landed at these places, and the general would go to meetings, and the crew would wander around and go to places around town, a couple of days each place. Gus Grissom and I were friends. Of course, I went to his party when he left Wright-Patterson to become an astronaut, not knowing I would join him later. But Gus was a remarkable. I was the first Maryland graduate to go to Case Western University for an internship. After my internship, the Berry Plan was in operation. The Berry Plan was a military plan to get more physicians into the military services right after the Korean War. And we had a choice of Air Force, Navy, or Army, and I chose the Air Force. So, and luckily I asked to be sent to flight surgery school, and they agreed to that. They sent me to flight surgery school in San Antonio, Texas for 3 months. And that was late 1957, I guess. I was assigned to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It was one of the major bases, and it had a big hospital there. I went there and showed up in front of the commander's office. And I was one of about 6 doctors. Myself, Jim Henry, and Bill Augerson were remarkable guys. They had been involved in the selection of the astronauts, which happened in the late 50s. Jim Henry and Bill Augerson, and Carmel Jackson was a young physician there. Bill Douglas was the physician for the astronauts, the personal physician for the astronauts. And Stan White was also one of the physicians there. So I think we're about 6 of us, or maybe 7. And to my knowledge, only 2 of us are still alive. Bill Augerson was a remarkable guy, a brilliant guy. And I just talked to him about a week ago because I told him I was going to do this. In the space agency, this organization of life sciences within the Space Task Group, it was an incredible operation. 500 men in this whole Space Task Group. Day and night, these guys working. I think the whole operation was run. I said, you know, my chief of neurology suggested I do neurology in the Air Force. He said, we don't need neurologists, son, we need psychiatrists. You're going to be a psychiatrist. I said, well, I'm not afraid of that. I had good psychiatric exposure in my internship in med school. I said, but I'd like to be a flight surgeon too. He says, we'll fix that up too. You can be a flight surgeon. The second year, I became a flight surgeon. And what happened was, there were 3 young doctors there, and we flipped a coin for fighter, bomber, or transport flight surgeons. I won the fighter. And I got a little nervous at first thinking about this, you know. But that turned out to be a wonderful opportunity. Wright-Patterson had some of the best fighter pilots in the Air Force, including Gus Grissom. He was there as a fighter pilot. And most of these guys, many of them had experiences in Korea, and